October 17, 1935, 10:14 p.m., Palace Chop House, Newark, New Jersey. The smell of stale beer and expensive cigars hung heavy in the back room. The only sound was the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of a bookkeeping machine and the low murmur of men who dealt in numbers that didn't belong to the government. At the head of the table sat Arthur Flegenheimer, better known to the world, and to the nightmares of his enemies, as Dutch Schultz. He was sweating, his eyes darting across ledgers. He was a man under siege, fighting the IRS, the special prosecutor Thomas Dewey, and his own frayed nerves. Suddenly the front door's bell chimed, a lonely, sharp sound in the quiet night. Then, the heavy rhythmic thud of boots on the floorboards. Click. The sound of a hammer cocking back on a cheap .38 revolver echoed through the hallway. A young man, barely 20, with a dirty trench coat and eyes wide with desperate greed, stepped into the light of the back room. He didn't see the shadows. He didn't see the heavy-set men in the corners. He only saw the cash box on the table. "Nobody move! Empty the box, now!" the kid screamed, his voice cracking like a dry twig. The room went ice cold. The bookkeepers froze, but Schultz didn't even look up from his ledger at first. He just sighed, a long, weary sound of a king tired of being pestered by flies. Slowly, the Dutchman raised his head. His eyes weren't filled with fear. They were filled with a dark, predatory boredom. "Do you have any idea?" Schultz whispered, his voice like sandpaper on silk. "Whose air you are breathing right now?" The kid's hand began to shake. He thought he was robbing a restaurant. He didn't realize he had just walked into the private office of the most volatile man in the American underworld. He had brought a toothpick to a landslide. To understand how a common street mugger accidentally signed his own death warrant, and how this moment would trigger the bloodiest night in the history of the syndicate, we have to look at the 3 days leading up to this click. The mistake wasn't pulling the trigger. The mistake was thinking the Dutchman was still human. 72 hours earlier, the Bronx, New York. Dutch Schultz wasn't just a gangster. He was a phenomenon of violence. He had built an empire on illegal beer during Prohibition and tightened his grip through the policy racket, the illegal lottery of the poor. But by 1935, the walls were closing in. Thomas Dewey, the relentless prosecutor, was a shark in a three-piece suit, and he was scenting blood. Schultz was hiding out in Newark because New York had become too hot. He was a man who lived in the details. He knew which cops were paid, which judges were scared, and which streets were safe. But paranoia is a corrosive acid. It eats the floor you're standing on. "They're coming for the numbers, Dutch," Bo Weinberg, his top lieutenant, had warned him days prior in a dimly lit social club. "The Italians, Lucky Luciano, they don't want to help you fight Dewey. They want to wait until Dewey breaks you so they can pick up the pieces." Schultz had slammed his fist onto a mahogany table, rattling the crystal glasses. "I built this. I survived the beer wars. If the commission thinks they can sit back and watch me drown, I'll pull them into the deep water with me." This was the context the young robber, Charles "Charlie" Workman, no relation to the hitman of the same name, lacked. Charlie was a small-time stick-up artist from the docks. He was hungry, he was high on cheap gin, and he was stupid. He had heard there was a high-stakes card game or a money drop at the Palace Chop House. He thought he was being clever. In the criminal hierarchy, there is a golden rule: know your target's shadow. Charlie didn't even know his own. He spent his last $5 on a box of ammunition, unaware that he was about to interrupt a council of war. As Charlie stood in that doorway in Newark, holding his shaking gun, he wasn't just facing a man. He was facing a cornered animal who had already decided that the only way to survive was to kill everyone, including the law. The kid thought he was the hunter. He didn't see the real hunters standing behind the curtain. October 17th, 10:15 p.m., Palace Chop House. The tension in the back room was thick enough to choke on. Abba Dabba Berman, the math genius who ran Schultz's numbers, slowly put his pen down. He looked at the kid with a strange kind of pity. "Son," Berman said softly, "put the heater away. Walk out. Forget you ever saw this door. It's the only way you see tomorrow." "Shut up! Shut up!" Charlie yelled, his eyes darting to the heavy gold watch on Schultz's wrist. "The watch too, give it to me." Schultz leaned back. The light from the green-shaded lamp caught the scars on his knuckles, reminders of his days as a bouncer. He looked at his men. They were waiting for a signal. But Schultz was enjoying this. For a moment, the pressure of the federal government and the threat of the Mafia Commission vanished. Here was a problem he could solve with his bare hands. "So you like this watch, kid?" Schultz asked, unbuckling the leather strap with agonizing slowness. "My mother gave me this. Well, she gave me the money. I took the money from a guy who owed me. It's got a lot of history." Every step Schultz took toward the boy felt like a drumbeat. The rain began to lash against the window pane, a rhythmic drumming that masked the sound of the city outside. The room smelled of wet wool and the ozone of an approaching storm. In the criminal world, reputation is the only currency that doesn't devalue. If Dutch Schultz let a punk walk in and rob him, he would be dead by morning, not by the kid's hand, but by his own men's loss of respect. Power is an illusion that requires constant maintenance. "Here," Schultz said, holding the watch out. "Come and take it." Charlie stepped forward, his feet tangling in the worn carpet. He reached out his left hand, the gun in his right wobbling. He was focused on the gold. He didn't see Schultz's shoulder dip. He didn't see the tactical shift in the Dutchman's stance. Decisions made in a second often take a lifetime to regret. Charlie's second was almost up. The moment Charlie's fingers brushed the cold metal of the watch, the world turned into a blur of grey and red. Schultz didn't grab the gun. He grabbed Charlie's throat. With the strength of a man who had spent his youth tossing beer barrels, he slammed the youth against the brick wall. The sound was sickening, a dull thud followed by the crack of bone. The .38 went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly into the floorboards, kicking up a splinter of wood that grazed the bookkeeper's cheek. "You come into my house!" Schultz roared, his face turning a purplish hue. "You threaten me?" He didn't use a gun. He used his fists, then a heavy glass ashtray from the table. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution by blunt force. The bodyguards, Lulu Rosenkrantz and Abe Landau, stood back. They knew better than to interfere when the Dutchman was cleaning house. The room was filled with the sounds of the struggle, the gasping of the boy, the rhythmic impact of the ashtray, and the heavy breathing of a man who had finally found an outlet for his rage. It was visceral, messy, and loud. The legend of the Dutchman was built on this, a terrifying, unhinged volatility. Finally, Schultz let the limp body drop. Charlie wasn't dead, but he wasn't there anymore. His eyes were rolled back, and the floor was stained with the evidence of his mistake. "Clean this up," Schultz commanded, wiping his hands on a linen napkin. "Throw him in the alley. If the cops find him, he fell. If he wakes up, tell him he's the luckiest man in Newark." But the violence had done something to the air. It had broken the seal of the evening. Schultz sat back down, his chest heaving, his adrenaline spiking. He looked at the blood on his cuff and started to laugh. It was a high wheezing sound that made the hair on the back of Berman's neck stand up. "I feel better," Schultz said. "Now, where were we? Ah, yes, killing Thomas Dewey." The robbery was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Because while Schultz was distracted by a small-time thief, the real professionals were parking their black Buick outside. October 17th, 10:25 p.m., outside the Palace Chop House. While Schultz was washing the blood off his hands in the men's room, two men stepped out of a car at the curb. They didn't have shaking hands, they didn't have cheap revolvers. They carried heavy-duty iron, a .45 automatic, and a sawed-off shotgun. These were the mortal consequences of Schultz's ambition. Weeks earlier, Schultz had stood before the commission, the board of directors for the National Crime Syndicate, and demanded permission to kill prosecutor Thomas Dewey. "If we kill a prosecutor, the heat will melt the whole city," Lucky Luciano had argued. "It's bad for business, Dutch. Sit down." But Schultz wouldn't sit down. "If you won't do it, I will," he had hissed. "I'll do it myself." That was the moment the commission decided that Dutch Schultz was a liability. He was a loose cannon in a world that now demanded corporate stability. They didn't care about the kid who tried to rob him. They cared about the man who was about to bring the wrath of the federal government down on their heads. The two hitmen, Charlie the Bug Workman, the professional, and Mendy Weiss, moved with the precision of ghosts. They knew the layout. They knew the guards. and they knew that inside the Dutchman was riding a high from his recent victory over a petty thief. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere had returned to a forced normalcy. The bookkeepers were back to their ledgers. Lulu and Abe were leaning against the bar. The smell of the Dutchman's steak dinner was beginning to fill the room. Schultz walked out of the restroom, adjusting his tie. He felt invincible. He had just crushed a threat with his bare hands. He felt like the king of the Bronx again. He didn't know that the click he heard earlier was just a rehearsal for the symphony of lead that was about to play. The greatest danger isn't the enemy who screams in your face. It's the one who waits for you to feel safe. October 17th, 10:30 p.m. Schultz felt a sudden cramp in his stomach, the result of stress, bad diner food, and the leftover adrenaline from the fight. He turned back toward the restroom. "Lulu, get me a ginger ale," he shouted over his shoulder. As he stepped into the small tiled bathroom, the front door of the Palace Chop House swung open. There was no bell this time. The hitmen had timed their entry with a passing truck's rumble. Mendy Weiss walked straight to the bar and leveled his shotgun at Lulu Rosenkrantz and Abe Landau. "Don't," was all he said. But these were Schultz's loyal dogs. They went for their guns. The room exploded. The sawed-off shotgun roared, a deafening blast that shattered the back bar mirrors, raining glass down like diamonds. Lulu took a hit to the chest, falling back, his gun firing wildly into the ceiling. Landau took a slug to the arm, but managed to fire back, grazing Weiss's shoulder. In the bathroom, Schultz froze. He heard the thunder of the shotgun. He saw the door handle turn. Charles Workman, the professional hitman, pushed the door open. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask for a watch. He saw Schultz standing by the sink, hands wet, eyes wide. Workman raised his .45. Pop, pop. The bullets were small sounds compared to the shotgun, but they were more precise. One hit Schultz in the side, tearing through his liver and spleen. The Dutchman didn't fall. He staggered, clutching the sink, the porcelain staining red instantly. Workman didn't stay to finish him. He had a schedule. He turned and ran back out into the chaos of the main room, where the air was thick with gun smoke and the screams of the wounded. The king of the Bronx was leaking his life into a Newark sewer, and the irony? He was shot in the same place he had just washed away the blood of a petty thief. October 18th, 02 a.m., Newark City Hospital. Dutch Schultz didn't die instantly. He was too stubborn for that. He was rushed to the hospital, his body a map of trauma. But as the infection from the gut shot began to set in, his mind began to fracture. Police stenographers sat by his bed, pens poised. They wanted names. They wanted the commission. They wanted to know who had finally pulled the plug on the Dutchman. What they got was a 20-hour stream of consciousness fever dream that would become legendary in true crime history. A boy has never wept, nor dashed 1,000 Kim. French-Canadian bean soup. I want to pay. Let them leave me alone, Schultz mumbled, his voice a ghostly rasp. He spoke of the big Frenchie, of hidden safes, of the man with the hat. To the police it was gibberish. To those who knew the underworld, it was the sound of a man's soul being shredded by the secrets he carried. Outside the hospital, the world was changing. The news of the shooting hit the wires like a lightning strike. In New York, Lucky Luciano sat in a quiet Italian restaurant sipping wine. He didn't need to ask if it was done. The silence from Newark told him everything. Back in the alleyway of the Palace Chop House, the small-time robber, Charlie, regained consciousness. He crawled through the mud, his face a mask of pain only to see the police tape and the bodies being carried out. He realized with a soul-shaking clarity that he had been a heartbeat away from a massacre. He had tried to rob a sinking ship. The Dutchman was dying. The empire was being carved up. And the only man who knew where the money was hidden was losing his mind, one word at a time. October 18th, 10:01 a.m., somewhere in the Catskill Mountains. The legend of Dutch Schultz didn't end with his breath. It grew with the mystery of his treasure. Rumors had circulated for years that Schultz, fearing the IRS, had converted his fortune into gold and bonds and buried it in a waterproof steel box in the woods of upstate New York. As he lay dying, he muttered, 10 billion, 5 billion, the iron box. The legend effect took hold. Even as his body was being prepared for a grave he wouldn't be allowed to stay in, as he was buried in a Catholic cemetery despite his Jewish roots. Thousands of people were already planning trips to the mountains with shovels. But the real treasure was the power vacuum. With Schultz out of the way, the numbers racket in Harlem was seized by the syndicate. The independent, violent, old-school gangsterism was dead. The corporate era of crime had begun. In his hospital bed, Schultz gave one final lucid look at the detective. "Common sense is a thing that a lot of people don't have," he whispered. It was his final judgment on the world, on the kid who tried to rob him, on the hitmen who shot him, and on the prosecutor who chased him. At 6:35 p.m. the Dutchman finally succumbed. He was 33 years old. He had lived 1,000 lives of violence and died a single lonely death in a city that didn't want him. The man was gone. The myth was just beginning. But what happened to the kid who started it all? November 1935, the aftermath. The Palace Chop House became a macabre tourist attraction before it finally closed its doors. People wanted to see the tiles where the Dutchman fell. They wanted to see the bullet holes. Charlie, the young robber, disappeared into the shadows of history. He never spoke of that night. Legend says he moved west, changed his name, and never touched a firearm again. He had looked into the eyes of a dying god and saw the void. He understood that in the world of the high stakes, there are no winners, only people who haven't lost yet. Thomas Dewey, the man Schultz wanted to kill, used the momentum of the Dutchman's death to propel himself to the governorship of New York and eventually 2 presidential nominations. The hit on Schultz had worked. The heat had dissipated because the problem was solved. The syndicate flourished. They had proven that no one, not even a legend, was bigger than the business. But on cold nights in the Bronx, old-timers still talk about the Dutchman's curse. They say he left more than gold in those mountains. He left a spirit of pure, unadulterated defiance. "Ninguém sabia até ser tarde," they would whisper in the bars. No one knew that the end of the Dutchman would be the start of a much darker, much quieter era of crime. Every empire has a climax. Schultz's climax was a messy, blood-soaked room in New Jersey, triggered by a boy who just wanted a gold watch. If you walk the streets of Newark today, you won't find the Palace Chop House. It's been replaced by the mundane architecture of progress. But the story remains. It's a story about the intersection of luck and doom. Dutch Schultz was a man of his time, vicious, brilliant, and ultimately obsolete. He was a shark in a world that was building aquariums. His death wasn't just a murder. It was a restructuring. The robbery that started it all serves as a haunting reminder. The smallest actions can trigger the largest collapses. If that kid hadn't walked in, would Schultz have been more alert? Would his guards have been more focused? Or was the Dutchman's fate already written in the ledgers he spent his life trying to balance? In the end, Schultz's treasure was never found. Maybe it never existed. Or maybe the treasure was the lesson he left behind, that in the world of shadows, the only thing you truly own is your reputation, and even that is written in blood that eventually washes away. The legend effect persists because we love the idea of the last of the Mohicans, even if that Mohican was a cold-blooded killer. We find meaning in the chaos, but look at the facts. A man who held a city in fear was taken down while he was in the bathroom, shortly after beating a teenager. There is no glory in the dark, only consequences. Would you have pulled that trigger if you were the kid in the hallway, or would you have seen the shadow of the Dutchman and turned back into the night? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the blood-stained history of the American Mafia, hit the like button and subscribe for more cinematic true crime stories. What do you think? Was Schultz's treasure real, or just the final lie of a dying man? Let us know in the comments below.